These are 10 cards you should never draft in Bloomburrow. It would almost be better if you didn't see them in packs. First up is Stocking the Pantry. It looks like a sweet synergy piece for +1/+1 counter decks, but unfortunately that is not a supported theme in this format. There isn't an archetype that does that, and there aren't even a lot of cards that have +1/+1 counters involved, and so this card is best left on the sidelines because it just isn't supported in the format. Next is Nightwhirl Hermit, a card that is just too understated in the early game to be worth it. 3 mana for a 1/4 does not do enough defensively to be worth the upside of potentially getting a 2/4 Vigilance unblockable in the late game when you do have Threshold enabled, and as such this is a card you should not be drafting. Next is Bandit's Talent. It has a lot of text and a lot of modes, but the problem with this card is that the main mode of this card is going to be spend 2 mana, make your opponent discard the worst spell in their hand, which is just not great because you're spending mana for this and your opponent is not spending mana for the discard part, and so you're just going to put yourself behind when you play this card, and the extra modes are not enough upside to justify playing such a weak effect. Next is Barkform Harvester, the most aggressively mediocre card I've ever seen. It's colorless, so it might look flexible and worth taking, but the problem is that it's just not good enough. 3 mana for a 2/3 reach is just not good enough stats these days. The 2 mana ability doesn't do anything, and the Changeling part is not enough flexibility to redeem the card, and as such, it is not one you should be drafting. Next is Long River's Pull, a card that has a decent text box but gets sunk by the mana cost. Double blue is just too hard to swing in the early turns if you have a conventional 9/8 mana base, because you really need to be able to cast this card on turn 2 to stop yourself from falling behind, and this card just fails to do so because a lot of the time in your decks you're going to have 1 island and 1 plains or something like that, and you won't be able to cast your Long River's Pull when you need it. So even though this card might have looked good based on the text box, be sure to keep an eye out for that mana value because that'll show you that you should not be drafting this card. Next is Dewdrop Cure, another card with a seemingly decent text box, but the problem is that by the time that text box is enabled, you're not really going to be that happy with it. So 3 mana to get back a couple of 2-drops is theoretically okay, but the problem is that it's not as easy to get 2-drops into your graveyard as you might think, and by the time you do have a couple of 2-drops to get back, those 2-drops are less valuable because the game has progressed and your opponent probably has some blockers and things of that nature, and so Dewdrop Cure just finds itself in an awkward spot in the format because it'll clog up your hand while you're trying to curve out, and by the time it is relevant, the cards it gets back are not that useful. So this is a card that you should not be drafting. Next is Otterball Antics. 2 mana for a 1/1 prowess creature is just too small ball and is not worth the upside of potentially flashing this back later. That's just the main problem with this card. 2 mana for a 1/1 doesn't really help defend you. A lot of the times, if you're trying to chain spells together, just having a random 1/1 that's just getting slightly bigger every time you do that isn't going to be enough upside for the chaining of your spells together to be like a reasonable payoff. And sometimes you might be able to like mill this card over or discard it, but the 4 mana flashback to get a 2/2 prowess creature is just not great, and overall this card is too slow and clunky to be worth drafting. Next is Stargaze, a card that is only really good if you have stabilized the board, have plenty of life to work with, and have a lot of mana, which is just 3 conditions that you really don't want on a card that you're hopefully casting for a lot of mana. You'd rather play an expensive card that is going to be able to help you stabilize by being a big creature that can block or things like that, and Stargaze just doesn't help you do that. Being a good card when you're ahead and already have the life total advantage and things like that is all well and good, but you just don't have room for cards like that in your deck a lot of the time, and so as such, Stargaze is not a card that you should be drafting. Next is Hoarder's Overflow, a really complicated card where you basically play this, play a bunch of other expensive things, and then eventually just like sacrifice this to get some extra cards. But just 4 mana over the play this for 2 mana and sacrifice this for 2 mana is just not great, because if you're able to play this and then play a bunch of expensive spells and still be in fine shape enough to then sacrifice this card, you're probably doing all right anyway. And the fact that if you top deck this after you've played your expensive spells, it does basically nothing is not great, and playing this on turn 2 is just going to put you behind. So don't be playing those Hoarder's Overflows. And then finally we have Gossip's Talent, a card that does very little when you play it for 2 mana, very little when you spend 2 more mana on it, and very little when you spend 4 mana on it. I don't think I've ever seen a card that you can spend 8 mana on and still just be drastically far behind the way Gossip's Talent lets you do so. It doesn't help you block, It doesn't help you if you're behind at all because it doesn't provide any defensive abilities other than kind of like a pseudo vigilance mode once you've spent the full 8 mana on it. And their surveilling mode is just too weak to justify this card. So you should just be leaving this on the sidelines, not drafting this card, and don't get trapped by thinking, oh, there's all these abilities on the card, because you just have to spend so much mana on it before you get anything that's of use to you. And even that is only of use to you if you are already ahead and able to maybe just like have a creature that is able to attack and your opponent doesn't have removal in all of these various conditions. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Leave hashtag 10 traps in the comments section down below if you made it to the end. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you next time.